Was a long day, I know how you feel. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the world outside start to fade away. Welcome back to the Mental Lullaby. Tonight, we aren't just looking for rest. We're giving your mind the permission it needs to let go. Using gentle psychological techniques and calming soundscapes will guide your nervous systems from the noise of the day into the quiet of the night. You have done enough for today. Now, it's time to simply be. Let's begin our journey into sleep.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mental Lullaby. If you're new here, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue exploring the deeper meanings hidden within the games we love. The Fall of Gods and the Drowning of Men. A complete history of Anor Londo and the flooding of New Londo introduction. 2 cities, one tragic destiny in the vast and intricate mythology of Dark Souls. Few locations carry as much narrative weight and symbolic significance as Anor Londo and New Londo. These 2 cities, one reaching toward the heavens in golden splendor, and the other submerged beneath dark waters in eternal torment, represent the duality of ambition and consequence that defines the entire Dark Souls universe. Their histories are inextricably linked, bound together by the desperate actions of gods and the terrible price paid by humanity. This is the story of divine hubris, of a kingdom's golden age and its inevitable decay, and of a catastrophic decision that condemned an entire city to a watery grave. To understand these cities is to understand the fundamental tragedy of the Dark Souls world. Anor Londo stands as a monument to the Age of Fire, built by Lord Gwyn himself as the seat of divine power and the architectural embodiment of the god's dominion over the world. Its spires pierce the clouds, its halls gleam with impossible light, and its very existence proclaims the eternal supremacy of the gods who claimed the Lord's souls and used them to overthrow the ancient dragons. Yet beneath this facade of eternal glory lies a hollowed-out shell, a beautiful illusion maintained by the last remaining deity to hide the truth that the gods have abandoned their city and their responsibilities. New Londo, by contrast, represents humanity's place in this divine hierarchy. Built in the shadow of Anor Londo, both literally and figuratively, it was a thriving human city that served as a testament to what mankind could achieve under the patronage and protection of the gods. The 4 kings who ruled New Londo were granted fragments of Gwyn's own soul, elevating them above ordinary men and binding them in covenant to the Lord of Sunlight. For a time, New Londo prospered, its citizens living in the reflected glory of the gods above. But when darkness came to New Londo, when the 4 kings fell to corruption and their subjects were transformed into Darkwraiths bent on stealing humanity itself, the response from above was swift and merciless. The sealers of New Londo flooded the entire city, drowning every man, woman, and child within its walls to contain the darkness below. These 2 cities tell parallel stories of decline and abandonment. Anor Londo, once filled with gods and their servants, now stands empty save for the illusions that mask its desolation. New Londo, once filled with living, breathing humanity, now contains only the tortured ghosts of the innocent sacrificed to protect the world above from the consequences of divine mistakes. Both cities are tombs, monuments to failed ideals, and the inevitable decay that comes when clinging to power becomes more important than the responsibility that power entails. The Age of Ancients preceded all of this, of course. In that primordial era, the world was unformed, shrouded in fog, a land of gray crags, ancient trees, and immortal dragons. There was no life, no death, no light, no dark, no heat or cold. There simply was eternal stagnation, unchanging and unchangeable. But then came fire, and with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. And of course, from the dark came beings who would find souls within the first flame, souls of tremendous power that would allow them to challenge the dragon's eternal dominion. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, claimed the mightiest of these Lord souls, a soul of light and lightning that granted him godlike power. With him came the Witch of Izalith, who found the soul of life, and Gravelord Nito, who claimed the soul of death. There was a fourth soul as well, the Dark Soul, found by a being so small and insignificant that it was barely noticed by the others. This was the soul that would become the progenitor of all humanity, distributed among countless humans, granting them the dark sign and the potential for both great strength and terrible corruption. Together, Gwyn and his allies waged war against the dragons. With the lightning bolts forged from Gwyn's soul, with the flames of chaos wielded by the Witch of Izalith, with the death and disease commanded by Nito, and with the crucial betrayal of Seath the Scaleless, who revealed the dragon's weakness to their stone scales, the gods overthrew the ancient order. The Age of Fire began, and with it came the Age of Gods, the age when Gwyn would build his kingdom in the sky and establish a hierarchy that would endure for countless ages. This is where our story truly begins, with the construction of Anor Londo and the establishment of divine rule. From those heights, we will trace the rise of godly power and the creation of New Londo below. We will witness the golden age when both cities thrived, explore the corruption that infected the four kings and spawned the Darkwraith threat, and chronicle the terrible decision to flood an entire city to contain that darkness. Finally, we will examine the ruins left behind, the ghosts that haunt New Londo's flooded streets, and the hollow illusion that has become of Anor Londo itself. These are not merely the stories of two cities. They are the story of the Dark Souls world itself, of the cycle of fire and dark, of the desperate attempts to preserve power even as it inevitably fades, and of the terrible sacrifices made in the name of prolonging what cannot be prolonged. They remind us that even gods can fall, that even the mightiest kingdoms can become empty shells, and that the price of power is often paid by those who never sought it in the first place. The rise of Anor Londo, the city of gods after the defeat of the ancient dragons and the establishment of the Age of Fire, Lord Gwyn set about creating a capital worthy of his divine status and the new age he had ushered into being. Anor Londo, the city of the gods, would be built on a scale and with a grandeur that proclaimed the eternal supremacy of the divine. Perched impossibly high, its foundations resting upon great arches and buttresses that themselves seemed to defy the laws of nature, Anor Londo was meant to be more than a city. It was a statement, a declaration that the gods existed on a plane above the mortal world, both literally and metaphorically. The architecture of Anor Londo is perhaps its most immediately striking feature. Every structure soars upward, reaching toward the eternal sun that Gwyn himself placed in the sky above his city. The buildings are constructed on a scale meant for beings far larger than humans, with doors that tower stories high and halls so vast that entire human villages could fit within single rooms. This was intentional, of course. The gods were not merely powerful. They were fundamentally different in nature from the mortals who would serve them. The architecture reinforced this difference, making any human who entered Anor Londo feel small, insignificant, reminded at every turn of the vast gulf between themselves and the divine. The great hall where Gwyn held court exemplified this principle. Massive columns of polished white stone rose to support a ceiling so high it seemed to touch the clouds themselves. Windows of crystalline glass, perhaps provided by Seath the Scaleless as part of his reward for betraying his dragon kin, allowed light to pour into the hall, creating an atmosphere of divine radiance. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the light from above and creating the impression that one walked through clouds of light itself. At the far end of this hall stood Gwyn's throne, elevated on a dais and crafted from materials that seemed to contain their own inner luminescence. But Anor Londo was more than mere spectacle. It was a functional seat of divine government, the center from which the gods administered their rule over the world below. Various deities made their homes in the different structures throughout the city. Gwyn himself resided in the central keep, surrounded by his most trusted knights and advisors. His daughter, Guinevere, the Princess of Sunlight, occupied chambers decorated with golden treasures and artifacts that celebrated the beauty and fertility she represented. His youngest child, Gwyndolin, hidden away due to his affinity for the moon rather than his father's son, maintained secret chambers beneath the city where he would eventually craft the elaborate illusion that would preserve Anor Londo's appearance long after the gods had departed. The Silver Knights served as Anor Londo's primary military force. These elite warriors, chosen from among the most skilled fighters and granted divine blessing by Gwyn himself, stood as eternal guardians of the city. Clad in ornate silver armor that reflected the sunlight streaming through Anor Londo's countless windows, they were stationed at key positions throughout the city, ever vigilant against threats both external and internal. Unlike the Black Knights who would accompany Gwyn into battle against the demons of Izalith and lose their minds to the flames of chaos, the Silver Knights remained in Anor Londo, a symbol of its inviolate sanctity. The four Knights of Gwyn represented the pinnacle of the Silver Knights Order. Ornstein the Dragon Slayer, captain of the four Knights, was perhaps the most renowned. His name alone struck fear into the hearts of dragons during the Great War, and even after the dragon's defeat, he remained at Gwyn's side as the ultimate protector of the Divine Order. Artorias the Abyss Walker, though he would eventually be stationed in Awalisile to combat the spreading darkness there, served initially as one of Anor Londo's greatest defenders. Hawkeye Gough, the giant archer whose skill was legendary even among gods, watched over Anor Londo from his vantage point. And Lord's blade Ciaran, mysterious and deadly, operated in the shadows, eliminating threats before they could fully manifest. The religious life of Anor Londo centered on the worship of the gods themselves, naturally, but also on the maintenance of the Age of Fire that made their rule possible. Priests and priestesses tended to the various shrines and altars throughout the city, offering prayers and sacrifices to ensure the continuation of the current age. The Dark Moon Blades, a covenant founded by Gwyndolin himself, operated as a sort of religious inquisition, hunting down those who sinned against the gods and enforcing divine law with absolute conviction. To be named a Dark Moon Blade was to be granted both great honor and terrible responsibility, tasked with protecting the sanctity of the gods' rule through whatever means necessary. The cultural life of Anor Londo during its golden age must have been extraordinary, though much of it is lost to time and the decay that eventually consumed the city. We know that great feasts were held in the massive dining halls, where gods and their most favored servants would gather to celebrate victories and commemorate important events. Artists and craftsmen worked to create wonders that glorified the gods and the Age of Fire. Scholars studied in libraries filled with knowledge accumulated since the overthrow of the dragons, seeking to understand the fundamental nature of souls and the flames that gave them power. Gwynevere, as Princess of Sunlight and symbol of bounty and fertility, likely presided over many of these cultural activities. Her very presence was said to bring warmth and comfort, a reflection of the sun her father had placed in the sky. Prayers offered to Gwynevere sought blessings for crops, for healthy children, for prosperity and growth. She represented the generative aspects of the Age of Fire, the promise that under the gods' rule, life would flourish and humanity would thrive under divine protection. Yet even in Anor Londo's golden age, there were hints of the problems to come. Gwyndolin, Gwyn's youngest child, was raised as a daughter despite being born male, because he possessed an affinity for the moon rather than the sun. This suggests that even the gods were bound by certain strictures and expectations, that deviation from the ordained path was problematic even for divine beings. Gwyndolin's relegation to the shadows, his secret chambers and hidden rituals, indicates that all was not perfect harmony even at the height of Anor Londo's power. The relationship between Anor Londo and the rest of the world was one of clear hierarchy. The gods ruled from above, and below them existed various gradations of servants, allies, and subjects. The humans who had emerged from the furtive pygmies division of the Dark Soul occupied an ambiguous position in this hierarchy. They were useful, certainly capable of great things when properly directed and motivated. But they also carried within them the Dark Soul's essence, the very thing that the Age of Fire was meant to suppress and control. Gwyn understood this, which is why he took such care to establish systems of control over humanity, granting favors and fragments of his power to human rulers who would enforce divine will upon their own people. This brings us to the founding of New Londo, the city below, and the 4 kings who would rule it under Gwyn's authority. But before we descend to examine that tragedy, we must first understand one more crucial event in Anor Londo's history: Gwyn's alliance with Seath the Scaleless and the consequences of the rewards granted to a traitor. The Dragon War and Seath's betrayal. The war against the dragons was the foundational myth of the Age of Gods, the great conflict that established the divine order and ended the eternal stagnation of the Age of Ancients. To understand Anor Londo and the world it dominated, we must understand this war, for its conduct and consequences shaped everything that followed. Moreover, the alliance with Seath the Scaleless and the rewards granted to him for his betrayal of his own kind established precedents that would echo through the ages, particularly in how the gods dealt with useful subordinates and the prices they were willing to pay for victory. The dragons of the Age of Ancients were beings of stone and scale, immortal and unchanging. They did not live in any meaningful sense. They simply existed, perched atop their gray crags, shrouded in eternal fog. They had no ambitions, no desires, no drives beyond the continuation of their static existence. They were, in essence, the perfect embodiment of the Age of Ancients itself, eternal, unchanging, and utterly without purpose or progression. When beings emerged from the dark and discovered the Lord souls within the first flame, the dragons did not initially perceive them as threats. Why would they? The dragons were immortal, their stone scales impervious to harm. What could these small, soul-bearing creatures possibly do to challenge their eternal dominion? This arrogance would prove to be their downfall, though not in the way one might expect. The dragons were not defeated through superior force or courage, though both played their parts. They were defeated through betrayal, through one of their own revealing the secret weakness that their scales concealed. Seath the Scaleless was born different from his dragon brethren. Whether this was due to some flaw in his creation or some cosmic accident, we do not know. What we do know is that Seath was born without the stone scales that granted the other dragons their immortality. This made him vulnerable, mortal in a way his kindred were not. More importantly, it made him other, separate, an outcast among his own kind. The other dragons recognized his difference and, in the manner of all insular groups confronting what is different, they shunned him. In his isolation and bitterness, Seath turned to study, obsessively researching the secrets of immortality and the nature of the scales he lacked. This research led him to understand the fundamental nature of dragon immortality better than any other being, dragon or otherwise. He knew precisely how the scales functioned, what forces could affect them, and what would be required to destroy them. And when Gwyn and his allies began their war against the dragons, Seath saw an opportunity for revenge against those who had rejected him. The betrayal was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Seath approached Gwyn and offered to share the secrets of dragon immortality in exchange for sanctuary and rewards in the new age that would follow the dragon's fall. Gwyn, recognizing the immense value of such knowledge, agreed. Seath revealed that while dragon scales were impervious to normal damage, they could be weakened and destroyed through specific applications of power. Gwyn's lightning could shatter them if applied with precision. The Witch of Izalith's flames could reduce them to ash. Niddo's death and disease could seep beneath them and corrupt the dragon from within. Armed with this knowledge, the war turned in the gods' favor. Dragons that had seemed invincible were suddenly vulnerable. Gwyn's lightning bolts, forged from his very soul, struck true and shattered scales that had endured since time immemorial. The Witch of Izalith's flames consumed dragons, reducing their immortal forms to ash and scattered bone. Niddo's miasma infected them, bringing death and decay to beings that had never known such concepts. One by one, the dragons fell, until only scattered remnants remained, fleeing to distant corners of the world or hiding in deep caverns where the gods' reach could not extend. Seath fought alongside the gods in this war, turning his knowledge and his bitterness against his own kind. For this, Gwyn rewarded him richly. Seath was granted a title, Duke, Lord of the Archives, making him nobility in the new order despite his dragon origins. He was given the Duke's Archives, a vast complex attached to Anor Londo itself, filled with countless texts and artifacts where he could continue his research into immortality and the nature of souls. Most significantly, Gwyn granted Seath a fragment of his own Lord Soul, a bequeathed Lord Soul shard that elevated Seath to a position of tremendous power and brought him closer to the immortality he so desperately craved. But Gwyn's generosity went even further. Recognizing that Seath's research required materials and subjects, the Lord of Sunlight granted the Scaleless one permission to conduct experiments, to pursue his obsessive quest for understanding immortality and achieving it for himself. This permission would have horrific consequences that Gwyn either did not foresee or chose to ignore in gratitude for Seath's crucial role in the dragon's defeat. Seath's experiments began innocuously enough. He studied crystals, discovering that they shared certain properties with dragon scales, particularly in their resistance to decay and change. He learned to grow and shape these crystals, eventually discovering methods to imbue them with soul energy, creating crystalline constructs that could serve as guardians and servants. The crystal golems that would eventually patrol the Duke's archives and the surrounding areas were products of this research. But Seath's true obsession was immortality, and crystals alone could not provide it. He needed living subjects to experiment upon, to test his theories about the nature of souls and flesh and the boundaries between mortality and its transcendence. Initially, he may have limited himself to volunteers or to criminals provided by Gwyn's justice system. But as his obsession deepened and his experiments grew more extreme, his need for subjects expanded beyond what such sources could provide. This is where the maidens came in. Young women were brought to the Duke's archives to serve as experimental subjects. Whether they were taken forcibly, volunteered, or were provided by Gwyn's justice system is not specified in the lore. What is clear from the evidence found in the archives is that Seath subjected them to horrific procedures, attempting to transform them, to grant them properties of immortality through crystallization and soul manipulation. The results were the Pizzicas, tragic creatures that were neither human nor dragon nor crystal, but something broken and wrong, shambling through the Duke's archives in eternal torment, their minds shattered by what had been done to them. It seems likely that Gwyn knew about these experiments, at least in general terms. The maidens' disappearances could not have gone entirely unnoticed. Yet there's no evidence he took action to stop them. Perhaps he felt the debt to Seath was too great, that without the Scaleless One's betrayal, the dragons could never have been defeated. Perhaps he believed that the pursuit of knowledge justified such sacrifices, or that the suffering of a few humans was acceptable if it advanced understanding of souls and immortality. Or perhaps, given what the lore suggests about the gods' priorities, he simply didn't care, seeing humans as tools to be used in service of the gods' purposes, their individual suffering irrelevant compared to the greater needs of maintaining the Age of Fire. This established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Age of Fire, the gods using humans for their own purposes, sacrificing them when necessary, and justifying such actions as required for the greater good. When we examine the flooding of New Londo later in this history, we will see the same pattern repeated on a far more massive scale. The precedent was set here in the Duke's archives, with Seath's experiments and Gwyn's tacit approval. Seath eventually achieved a form of immortality through the primordial crystal, a unique artifact that granted him the very thing he had sought throughout his existence. But this immortality came at the cost of his sanity. By the time the chosen undead encounters him, Seath has become a mad thing, surrounded by the products of his failed experiments, still obsessively pursuing knowledge that always seems just beyond his grasp. His treasures, accumulated over countless ages, fill his archives, but they have brought him no peace, no satisfaction, only an endless, insane hunger for more. The alliance with Seath and its consequences reveal much about Anor Londo and the gods who ruled from it. They were pragmatic, willing to ally with anyone who could help them maintain power, regardless of that ally's nature or methods. They were ruthless, unconcerned with the suffering of those beneath them if such suffering served their purposes. And they were ultimately short-sighted, unable or unwilling to see how their actions might have long-term consequences that would eventually contribute to their own downfall. These same qualities would manifest again when Gwyn established New Londo and granted power to the Four Kings. But we must first examine Anor Londo at the height of its power, when the gods seemed eternal and their rule unquestionable, before we descend to the city below and the darkness that would consume it. Gwyn's kingdom at its height. The Four Knights and divine authority, the period following the dragon's defeat and preceding the flowering of the Chaos Flame in Izalith, represents Anor Londo at its absolute zenith. This was the era when the gods seemed truly immortal, when their power appeared unassailable, and when the Age of Fire burned brightest. At the center of this golden age stood Gwyn himself, the Lord of Sunlight, surrounded by his most powerful and loyal servants, the Four Knights who would become legendary throughout the ages. Ornstein, Artorias, Gough, and Ciaran. These four warriors represented the pinnacle of martial prowess and absolute loyalty to Gwyn and the Divine Order. Each was extraordinary in their own right, but together they formed a force that could face any threat to Anor Londo's security and the stability of the Age of Fire. Their stories, victories, and eventual fates illuminate not only the character of Anor Londo at its height, but also the inevitable decay that would consume even the mightiest of the god's servants. Ornstein the Dragonslayer, captain of the Four Knights, was perhaps the most renowned warrior of his age. His very title proclaimed his greatest achievement. During the war against the dragons, Ornstein had personally slain more of the ancient beasts than any other warrior save Gwyn himself. His weapon, the Dragonslayer spear, was crafted specifically to pierce dragon hide and scale, and he wielded it with such skill that even the mightiest dragons learned to fear his approach. Tall and powerful, clad in golden armor adorned with the crest of a lion, Ornstein commanded respect through his mere presence. As captain, Ornstein's primary duty was the defense of Anor Londo itself and the protection of Gwyn's family. He stood as the last line of defense against any who would threaten the gods, a living embodiment of divine military might. His loyalty was absolute and unquestioning. When Gwyn issued commands, Ornstein executed them without hesitation or doubt. This absolute loyalty would later be tested when Ornstein was tasked with guarding Guinevere, or rather, with guarding the illusion of Guinevere that Gwyndolin created to maintain the appearance that Anor Londo remained populated by gods. Even after every other deity had abandoned the city, even after it became clear that he guarded only shadows and lies, Ornstein remained at his post, a testament to the strength of his oath and the depth of his devotion. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, presents a more complex and ultimately more tragic figure. Whereas Ornstein's loyalty never wavered and his duty never changed, Artorias was tasked with combating the forces of the Abyss wherever they emerged. This would eventually lead him to Owalasile to confront the spreading darkness there. Artorias was renowned for his courage and his skill with a great sword that he wielded with both elegance and devastating power. He was also known for his companion, the great wolf Seath, who fought at his side and was perhaps the only being Artorias truly loved. Before his deployment to Owalasile, Artorias served as one of Anor Londo's greatest champions. He walked without fear in places where even other gods hesitated to tread, investigating threats to the divine order and eliminating them before they could fully manifest. To enable him to combat the Abyss, he forged a covenant with the creatures of that dark realm, obtaining a ring that would allow him to traverse the Abyss without being consumed by it, a necessary tool for one who would be called the Abyss Walker. When Owalasile fell to the Abyss, corrupted by the machinations of Manus, the primeval man, Artorias was dispatched to investigate and eliminate the threat. This mission would be his last. Despite his legendary skill and the protection of his covenant ring, Artorias was overwhelmed by the Abyss. In a final act of heroism, he used the last of his strength to protect Seath with a barrier, saving his companion even as he himself was consumed by the very darkness he had sworn to fight. The knight Artorias who the chosen undead eventually encounters is a corrupted, maddened shell, his mind destroyed by the Abyss, his once graceful movements reduced to wild, desperate flailing. His fate stands as a stark reminder that even the mightiest servants of the gods could fall, that the darkness they fought was not some distant, abstract threat but a real and terrible force that could consume anyone, no matter how strong or loyal. Hawkeye Gough, the giant archer, represents yet another aspect of the Four Knights' diversity. Gough was, quite literally, a giant, towering over even the other knights and possessed of strength that few could match. But it was not his physical might that made him legendary. It was his skill with a bow. Gough could fire arrows with such power and precision that he could bring down dragons in flight, striking them from distances that seemed impossible. His great bow and specialized arrows were weapons of almost mythical capability. Despite his fearsome reputation as a warrior, Gough was also known for his gentle nature and his skill as a craftsman. When not fighting, he carved wooden statues, creating works of surprising delicacy and beauty. This combination of deadly martial prowess and artistic sensitivity made Gough a complex figure, suggesting that even in Anor Londo's militaristic culture, there was room for pursuits beyond simple violence. Gough's ultimate fate was to be isolated in his tower in what would later be known as Owalasile Township. His helmet was stuffed with resin, rendering him effectively blind. Whether this was done maliciously by those who feared his power or was the result of some other circumstance remains a matter of interpretation. By the time the chosen undead encounters him, Gough has been isolated for so long that he has lost track of time itself. Yet even in this condition, he maintains his skill, his dignity, and his loyalty to the memory of what Anor Londo once represented. Lord's Blade Ciaran, the final member of the Four Knights, is the most mysterious. She operated in shadow rather than light, eliminating threats to the divine order through assassination and subterfuge rather than open combat. Wielding paired weapons, the Golden Tracer and the Dark Silver Tracer, Ciaran could move with supernatural speed and silence, dispatching targets before they even knew she was present. There are hints in the lore that Ciaran may have had a romantic relationship with Artorias, or at least harbored deep feelings for him. When encountered in the Artorias of the Abyss content, she is found mourning at the site of Artorias' grave, and she begs the chosen undead to give her Artorias' soul, offering her own weapons in trade. This suggests a depth of feeling and a capacity for grief that seems at odds with her role as an assassin, reminding us that even the most deadly servants of the gods were still individuals capable of love and loss. Together, these four knights represented the power and diversity of Gwyn's forces at Anor Londo's height. They were proof that the divine order could command absolute loyalty from the most skilled and powerful warriors, that service to the gods was the highest calling one could aspire to. Their presence deterred threats both external and internal, maintaining the stability that allowed Anor Londo to flourish. But the four knights were only the most visible element of Anor Londo's military might. The Silver Knights formed the backbone of the city's defenses, stationed at key positions throughout the sprawling complex. These elite warriors, while not equal to the four knights in individual prowess, were still formidable fighters, each one capable of defeating dozens of lesser opponents. They served with pride and discipline, maintaining perfect order even during the long, quiet periods when no threats manifested. The religious and cultural life of Anor Londo during this period was rich and complex. Gwyndolin, though hidden away due to his moon affinity, founded the Dark Moon Blades, a covenant of warriors dedicated to hunting down those who sinned against the gods. These blades operated throughout the world, not just in Anor Londo itself, serving as enforcers of divine law and punishers of those who would transgress against the gods' edicts. To be invaded by a Dark Moon Blade was to face judgment for one's crimes, and few survived such encounters. Guinevere, the Princess of Sunlight, presided over the more public aspects of Anor Londo's religious life. She received petitioners, blessed those who sought divine favor, and served as a visible symbol of the gods' benevolence and power. Her chambers were filled with treasures and artifacts, each one a gift from grateful supplicants or a trophy commemorating some great deed done in the gods' service. To stand in her presence was said to be overwhelming, her divine radiance so intense that ordinary mortals could barely endure it. The servants and administrators who maintained Anor Londo's day-to-day operations were numerous and efficient. They ensured that the city functioned smoothly, that supplies were procured and distributed, that the various gods and their retinues had what they needed. The logistics of maintaining a city as vast as Anor Londo must have been staggering, requiring coordinated effort from hundreds or thousands of individuals working in concert. Yet even at this height, there were cracks in the foundation. The very structure of Anor Londo's society, with gods at the top and humans serving below, contained the seeds of future problems. The gods' treatment of humanity as tools to be used rather than beings with their own inherent worth and dignity created resentment that would eventually manifest in various forms of rebellion and corruption. The precedent set by allowing Seath's experiments showed that the gods placed their own interests and the interests of their allies above any concern for human welfare. Moreover, Gwyn's obsession with maintaining the Age of Fire at any cost was already apparent. He had claimed the most powerful Lord's soul and used it to establish a divine hierarchy that placed him and his fellow gods at the apex of all creation. But the fire was not eternal, and Gwyn would have understood this. Even at Anor Londo's height, he would have been aware that the flame was slowly diminishing, that the Age of Fire would eventually come to an end unless something was done to prevent it. This knowledge likely drove many of his decisions, including the establishment of New Londo and his bargain with the Four Kings, as we shall see. The relationship between Anor Londo and the rest of the world during this period was one of unquestioned dominance. The gods ruled, and all others obeyed. Human kingdoms and settlements existed at the sufferance of the divine, permitted to thrive so long as they served the gods' purposes and accepted their place in the hierarchy. Those who proved useful were rewarded with fragments of power, as the Four Kings would be. Those who rebelled or threatened the divine order were crushed without mercy. This brings us at last to New Londo, the city built below Anor Londo in both physical and metaphorical space. To understand New Londo's founding and its purpose, we must understand it as an extension of Anor Londo's power, a demonstration of how the gods administered the human populations under their control, and how they rewarded those who served them faithfully. The Four Kings were meant to be another success story, another example of how humans could thrive under divine patronage. Instead, their fall would precipitate one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the Dark Souls world. New Londo, the city below while Anor Londo reached toward the heavens, proclaiming divine supremacy over the world. New Londo was built on more earthly foundations, rooted in the material world where humanity lived and died. This city represented Gwyn's approach to governing human populations. Grant them a measure of autonomy and power, bind them to the divine order through oaths and gifts, and use them as a buffer between the gods and the darker forces that threatened the Age of Fire. New Londo was meant to be a shining example of what humanity could achieve under godly patronage. A city where humans could thrive while still acknowledging and serving the supremacy of Anor Londo above. The location chosen for New Londo was significant. Built literally in the shadow of Anor Londo, the city occupied lower elevations, connected to the divine city through bridges and pathways that allowed communication and commerce while maintaining a clear physical separation between gods and mortals. This geography reinforced the social hierarchy. The gods literally looked down upon the humans below, while humans looked up toward the divine city above. Yet New Londo was no mere slum or servants' quarters. It was a proper city with grand architecture of its own, sophisticated infrastructure, and a culture that, while influenced by Anor Londo, developed its own distinct character. The Four Kings who ruled New Londo were not born to their position. They were chosen by Gwyn himself, elevated from among humanity to serve as rulers and administrators of the human city. This was a tremendous honor, of course, but it was also a burden. The Four Kings were expected to maintain order, ensure New Londo's loyalty to the divine hierarchy, and manage the human population in a way that served the gods' interests while preventing unrest or rebellion. To enable them to fulfill these duties, Gwyn granted the Four Kings fragments of his own Lord's soul. This was an extraordinary gift, similar to what he had granted to Seath the Scaleless, elevating the kings above ordinary humanity and granting them powers that approached the divine. With these soul fragments came extended lifespans, superhuman abilities, and the authority to speak with the backing of Gwyn's own power. The kings were meant to be living bridges between humanity and divinity, proof that service to the gods could elevate even mortals to greatness. The four kings ruled as a council rather than a hierarchy, each one equal in power and authority to the others. This structure had advantages. Decisions could be made collectively, reducing the risk of tyranny or poor judgment from a single ruler. It also created a system of checks and balances, where each king could restrain the others if necessary. For a time, this system functioned well. The kings governed wisely, New Londo prospered, and the relationship between the human city and Anor Londo above remained harmonious. New Londo's society during its golden age was stratified but mobile. At the top stood the four kings themselves, wielding both temporal and spiritual authority. Below them were noble families who had proven their loyalty and competence, administrators and military leaders who maintained order and managed the city's various functions. Merchants and craftsmen formed a prosperous middle class, benefiting from New Londo's position as a hub of trade and commerce. And at the bottom were laborers and servants, who performed the essential work that kept the city running. But unlike some rigidly hierarchical societies, New Londo offered opportunities for advancement. Skill and loyalty could elevate one's station. A talented craftsman could become wealthy and influential. A brave soldier could rise through the military ranks to positions of authority. The four kings themselves stood as ultimate proof that even humans could reach heights of power previously unimaginable. This social mobility, combined with the prosperity that New Londo enjoyed, created a relatively stable and content population. The architecture of New Londo reflected its status as a proud human city operating under divine patronage. Buildings were constructed on a human scale, unlike the towering structures of Anor Londo, but they were still impressive, featuring sophisticated stonework, elegant bridges spanning the waterways that ran through the city, and public spaces designed to foster community and commerce. The city had a distinct aesthetic, favoring darker stones and more subdued colors compared to Anor Londo's brilliant whites and golds, creating an atmosphere of seriousness and dignity rather than overwhelming divine radiance. Religious life in New Londo centered on worship of the gods of Anor Londo, naturally, but with a particularly strong emphasis on Gwyn himself as the patron of the four kings and, by extension, the city as a whole. Temples and shrines throughout New Londo offered places for citizens to pray and make offerings, seeking divine blessing for their endeavors. The four kings themselves led major religious ceremonies, reinforcing their dual role as both temporal rulers and spiritual intermediaries between their human subjects and the gods above. The military forces of New Londo were substantial and well-trained. The city maintained its own army, separate from but allied with the Silver Knights of Anor Londo. New Londo's soldiers were equipped with weapons and armor of high quality, reflecting the city's prosperity and the importance Gwyn placed on maintaining military strength in the human territories. These forces served multiple purposes. They defended New Londo from external threats, maintained internal order, and could be called upon by Anor Londo to support the gods' military operations when needed. Trade and commerce flourished in New Londo. The city's location made it a natural hub for merchants traveling between various human settlements, and its connection to Anor Londo gave it access to goods and knowledge that other cities could not easily obtain. Craftsmen in New Londo produced weapons, armor, tools, and luxury goods that were prized throughout the known world. The city's markets bustled with activity, coins and goods changing hands in transactions that enriched both individual merchants and the city's coffers through taxation. Cultural life in New Londo blended human traditions with influences from Anor Londo above. Artists created works that celebrated both human achievement and divine glory. Scholars studied texts provided from Anor Londo's libraries, though they did not have access to Seath's archives or the most secret knowledge reserved for gods and their closest servants. Musicians and performers entertained in taverns and theaters, providing respite from the daily grind of work and contributing to a vibrant urban culture. The relationship between New Londo and Anor Londo during this period was complex. On the surface, it appeared to be one of simple subordination. New Londo served Anor Londo, the four kings obeyed Gwyn, and human interests were secondary to divine will. But the reality was more nuanced. The four kings had genuine authority over their domain and could make decisions without constant oversight from above. They governed with a degree of autonomy that allowed them to address specifically human concerns and problems in ways that the distant gods might not have understood or cared about. This autonomy, however, came with strict limitations. The kings understood that their power was derived from Gwyn and could be revoked if they displeased him. They were expected to maintain order, prevent any threats to the Age of Fire from emerging in their territory, and ensure that New Londo's human population remained loyal and useful to the divine order. Within these constraints, they had considerable freedom, but stepping outside them would bring swift and terrible consequences, as would later be demonstrated. New Londo also served a strategic purpose in the gods' management of humanity. By concentrating a large human population in one location under rulers bound to divine authority, Gwyn could more easily monitor and control potential threats. Humans were carriers of the Dark Soul's essence, the fragments distributed by the furtive pygmy, and this made them both valuable and dangerous. They had the potential for great strength and achievement, but they also had an inherent connection to the dark that the Age of Fire was meant to suppress. New Londo allowed the gods to harness humanity's useful qualities while minimizing the risks their dark nature posed. The system seemed to work perfectly. New Londo thrived. Its citizens prospered under the wise rule of the four kings, and the city served as a model for how humans could live successfully under divine authority. But this success contained within it the seeds of catastrophe. The very autonomy granted to the four kings, the power given to them to rule effectively, created an opportunity for corruption. And the fragments of Gwyn's soul that elevated the kings also made them targets for forces that sought to subvert the divine order. Into this prosperous, stable city came Darkstalker Kaathe, the primordial serpent, bearing lies and dark truths in equal measure. His arrival would shatter New Londo's golden age, corrupt the four kings, and ultimately lead to the city's complete destruction. But before we examine that catastrophe, we must understand the ideology Kaathe preached and why it found such fertile ground in the hearts of the four kings who had seemed so loyal to Gwyn's order. The Age of Fire, Kaathe argued, was not the natural state of the world but rather an imposition, a perversion of the natural cycle that should see fire fade and dark rise in turn. Gwyn had manipulated events to extend his age beyond its proper span, holding back the darkness that should rightfully inherit the world. And humanity, Kaathe claimed, was meant to be the inheritor of that age of dark, not the servants of fading gods. The dark soul that humans carried within them was not a curse or a danger, but their true nature and their rightful inheritance. Why did this message resonate with the four kings? We can only speculate, but several factors likely contributed. The kings had been granted great power, yes, but that power was always conditional, always dependent on Gwyn's continued favor. They ruled at his sufferance, not by their own right. Perhaps they chafed at this subordination, yearning for true independence rather than granted autonomy. Perhaps they saw the signs that the Age of Fire was indeed fading and feared what would happen to them and their city when the gods could no longer maintain their power. Or perhaps Kaathe's message appealed to something deeper. The idea that humanity had its own destiny, separate from and potentially superior to the gods who currently ruled over them. Whatever the reasons, the four kings listened to Kaathe. And in listening, they took the first steps down a path that would lead to New Londo's complete annihilation and the transformation of its citizens into the very monsters the gods feared most. The corruption of the four kings would prove to be one of the greatest disasters of the Age of Fire, a crisis so severe that it would force Gwyn and his allies to make an unthinkable choice: the complete destruction of an entire city and all its inhabitants to prevent the darkness from spreading further. The Darkwraith crisis. Kaathe's corruption and the fall of the four kings. Darkstalker Kaathe was one of two primordial serpents known to have interacted significantly with the events of the Age of Fire, the other being Kingseeker Frampt. While Frampt served as an agent of the gods, guiding chosen undead toward linking the fire and perpetuating the Age of Fire, Kaathe worked toward the opposite end, the return of the Age of Dark and the elevation of humanity to its rightful place as inheritors of the world. Whether these two serpents were truly opposed to each other or were secretly working in concert, playing both sides of a cosmic game for their own inscrutable purposes, remains one of the great mysteries of Dark Souls lore. What is clear is that Kaathe's arrival in New Londo marked a turning point, the moment when the city's golden age began its descent into nightmare. The primordial serpent came bearing a message that was simultaneously seductive and terrifying. The Age of Fire was ending, the gods were fading, and humanity could either cling to the dying order or embrace their true nature and claim their inheritance. For the four kings, who had spent their reign maintaining the divine order that Gwyn had established, this message represented both a threat and an opportunity. Kaathe's philosophy centered on several key claims. First, he argued that Gwyn had artificially extended the Age of Fire beyond its natural span by linking the first flame with his own soul, perpetuating an age that should have ended long ago. This linking was not a heroic sacrifice but a selfish act, an attempt to preserve the god's power at the expense of the natural cycle of fire and dark. Second, Kaathe claimed that the dark was not something to be feared, but rather the natural state that should follow the Age of Fire, just as night follows day. Third, and most importantly for his pitch to the Four Kings, he argued that humans were meant to rule in this Age of Dark, that the dark soul they carried was not a burden or curse but the key to their ascension. To prove his claims and demonstrate the power available to those who would embrace the dark, Kaathe taught the Four Kings about humanity, not just as a concept but as a resource that could be harvested and accumulated. In Dark Souls lore, humanity is both the essence of the dark soul distributed among all humans and a tangible thing that can be taken and used. Normally, humanity is released upon death, returning to the cycle of souls. But Kaathe taught the kings how to actively steal humanity from living beings, to drain the very essence of their dark nature and accumulate it for themselves. This knowledge transformed into practice would give birth to the Darkwraiths. The Four Kings, convinced by Kaathe's arguments or simply seduced by the promise of power, began to implement what they had learned. They transformed themselves first, drawing upon the dark and reshaping themselves into something neither fully human nor fully divine but rather beings of dark. The fragments of Gwyn's soul they carried were corrupted or perhaps revealed their true nature when mixed with the concentrated dark they were accumulating. The kings became consumed by an insatiable hunger for humanity, driven to drain it from others in an endless quest for more power. But the kings did not stop with themselves. They began to convert others to their cause, creating an order of Darkwraiths sworn to the service of Kaathe and the coming Age of Dark. These Darkwraiths were granted dark hands, spectral weapons that could reach into a victim and forcibly extract their humanity, leaving behind empty husks that would eventually become hollow. The Darkwraiths ranged out from New Londo, invading other regions, attacking travelers and settlements, stealing humanity wherever they could find it. The transformation of New Londo society under this new order must have been gradual at first, then increasingly rapid as the corruption spread. The Four Kings likely began with those closest to them, loyal servants and followers who would embrace the dark willingly or could be convinced to do so through promises of power. These early converts became the core of the Darkwraith Covenant, elite warriors blessed with dark powers in exchange for their service in gathering humanity. As the number of Darkwraiths grew, their activities became impossible to hide. Reports reached Anor Londo of invaders dressed in black, attacking without warning or mercy, stealing something essential from their victims and leaving them as empty shells. Entire villages fell silent, their populations either killed or hollowed, drained of their humanity by Darkwraith raids. The threat was growing exponentially, each Darkwraith capable of creating more hollow victims, the stolen humanity making the Darkwraiths themselves stronger and more dangerous. The citizens of New Londo who had not been converted to the Darkwraith cause found themselves trapped in an increasingly nightmarish situation. Their rulers had transformed into monsters. Their city had become a base for invaders who preyed upon other human settlements, and resistance seemed futile against enemies wielding dark powers they could not understand or combat effectively. Some fled, escaping New Londo and spreading word of what was happening there. Others hid, hoping to avoid notice until someone or something could end the crisis. Still others had their humanity stolen, joining the growing number of hollows wandering the city's streets, their minds and identities destroyed. From Anor Londo's perspective, the situation represented a catastrophic failure of their system of human management and, more critically, an existential threat to the Age of Fire itself. The Darkwraiths were not merely raiders or rebels. They were actively working to hasten the Age of Dark, stealing humanity to strengthen themselves and weaken the forces that supported the current age. If left unchecked, they could theoretically gather enough power to challenge the gods directly or, at minimum, so thoroughly destabilize the world that the Age of Fire would collapse prematurely. Gwyn faced a terrible choice. He could attempt to retake New Londo through military force, sending the Silver Knights and perhaps even some of his divine allies to storm the city and eliminate the Darkwraiths. This approach had several problems. First, the Darkwraiths had proven formidable in combat, and their dark powers gave them advantages over conventional forces. Second, New Londo's architecture, with its narrow streets and many bridges, favored defenders over attackers. Third, and perhaps most importantly, such a campaign would be costly in terms of divine resources and might ultimately fail, allowing at least some Darkwraiths to escape and continue their predations elsewhere. There was another option, one that would ensure complete containment of the Darkwraith threat at the cost of every innocent life remaining in New Londo. The city could be flooded, drowned beneath water that would trap the Darkwraiths and prevent their escape. The undead nature of the Darkwraiths meant they would not die from drowning, but they would be contained, imprisoned in their own city, unable to continue their raids on the outside world. The living citizens who remained in New Londo would also drown, of course, but this was deemed an acceptable price for preventing the spread of the dark. While the lore does not explicitly state that Gwyn personally ordered the flooding, the decision to sacrifice New Londo to contain the Darkwraith threat would have required approval at the highest levels of divine authority. Whether Gwyn gave the order directly or the sealers acted with his tacit blessing, the result reveals much about the priorities of Anor Londo's order. The Lord of Sunlight, who had defeated the dragons and established the Age of Fire, who had built Anor Londo as a monument to divine glory, permitted or commanded the drowning of an entire city of humans to preserve the order he had created. The thousands of innocent citizens drowned in the flooding were not enemies of the gods. They were simply in the way, collateral damage in the gods' war against threats to their power. The decision made, the execution was entrusted to a group of 3 sorcerers known as the Sealers of New Londo. These individuals, led by a man named Ingward, were practitioners of magic who specialized in sealing and binding techniques. They were loyal to the divine order and willing to carry out the terrible task assigned to them, though whether they acted on direct orders from Anor Londo or made this agonizing decision themselves remains unclear from the available lore. What is certain is that the weight of what they were about to do must have been crushing. The mechanism of New Londo's flooding is not entirely clear from the lore, but it appears that the sealers used their magic to break or open barriers that had previously held back water sources around and beneath the city. New Londo's location in a low-lying area, surrounded by water sources, made it vulnerable to such an attack. Once the seals were broken, water rushed in with devastating speed, filling the lower levels of the city first and then rising inexorably through the streets and buildings. The citizens of New Londo had little warning and no chance to escape. Those who were not Darkwraiths, the ordinary men, women, and children who had lived in the city, found themselves trapped as water filled their homes and workplaces. The desperate scramble for higher ground was futile. The water rose too quickly and filled every space. Thousands drowned, their screams silenced as water filled their lungs. Families died together, clutching each other as the flood took them. The entire population of New Londo, save the Darkwraiths who could not die by such means, was exterminated in a single catastrophic act. The sealers watched this happen, maintaining their magical seals to ensure the water remained trapped within the city even after the initial flooding was complete. They had condemned an entire city to death, sacrificing thousands of innocents to contain a threat that those innocents had not created and could not control. The psychological toll of this act must have been immense. Ingward, the leader of the Sealers, remained in the flooded ruins for ages afterward, maintaining the seals and standing as a solitary guardian to ensure that what had been contained remained contained. The immediate aftermath of the flooding saw New Londo transformed from a living city into a submerged tomb. The Darkwraiths, unable to die from drowning, were trapped in the flooded ruins, contained but not destroyed. The souls of those who had drowned in the flood remained as well, bound to the location of their death, manifesting as ghosts that would eternally haunt the flooded streets. These ghosts were trapped in a state between life and death, unable to move on, condemned to endlessly relive their final moments of terror and suffering. From Anor Londo's perspective, the flooding was a success. The Darkwraith threat had been contained, prevented from spreading to other regions. The fact that this containment required the genocide of an entire human city was, in the gods' calculus, an acceptable cost. They had demonstrated that they would take any action, no matter how extreme, to preserve the Age of Fire and their own power. The message to other human settlements was clear: serve the gods faithfully, or suffer New Londo's fate. But this act also revealed the fundamental weakness and moral bankruptcy of the divine order. The gods had failed to protect New Londo from Kaathe's corruption. Their system of rule, which relied on granting power to human intermediaries while expecting absolute loyalty, had proven vulnerable to subversion. Rather than acknowledging this failure and addressing its root causes, they had simply destroyed the evidence and everyone associated with it. The flooding of New Londo was not a solution. It was a cover-up, an attempt to erase a problem rather than solve it. Conclusion: Legacy and the Cycle of Fire. The histories of Anor Londo and New Londo encapsulate the central tragedy of the Dark Souls universe. The desperate attempt to preserve power and order beyond their natural span, and the terrible costs inflicted on those who had no voice in these decisions. These two cities, one ascending toward divine heights and the other built for humanity below, both met similar fates despite their different purposes and populations. They stand as monuments to the inevitable decay that comes when beings cling to fading power rather than accepting change. The flooding of New Londo and the abandonment of Anor Londo represent two approaches to the same fundamental problem: the ending of the Age of Fire. New Londo was destroyed to contain a threat to that age, its entire population sacrificed without hesitation to prevent the spread of darkness. Anor Londo was abandoned when maintaining it became too costly, when the gods themselves fled from the responsibilities they had claimed. Both responses reveal the moral bankruptcy at the heart of the divine order. What makes these stories particularly tragic is that the problems both cities faced were largely self-inflicted. The Darkwraith crisis emerged because Gwyn's system of granting power to humans while expecting absolute loyalty proved vulnerable to corruption when those humans were offered an alternative vision. The fading of the fire that led to Anor Londo's abandonment was hastened by Gwyn's own attempts to artificially extend his age, creating instabilities and consequences that made the decline he feared inevitable. The ruins left behind serve as physical reminders of these failures. New Londo's flooded streets, filled with the tortured ghosts of innocents murdered by the gods' decision, testify to the price humanity pays for divine mistakes. Anor Londo's empty halls, maintained through elaborate illusions to hide the gods' abandonment, reveal the hollowness at the center of divine authority. Neither city offers hope or promise. Both speak only of loss and the futility of resisting natural change. For those who explore these ruins in the game, the experience becomes an education in the true nature of the world they're being asked to preserve. Every ghost in New Londo, every silver knight still mechanically patrolling empty Anor Londo corridors, every treasure left to gather dust. All of it asks the same question: is this really worth saving? Is the Age of Fire, with all its catastrophes and betrayals, truly superior to the unknown Age of Dark that would follow its end? The parallel fates of these cities also illuminate the relationship between gods and humans in the Dark Souls world. Humans were valued only as tools, granted power and autonomy when it served divine purposes, destroyed without mercy when they became problematic. The four kings were elevated as examples of what humans could achieve under divine patronage. Then their entire city was drowned when they turned to darkness. This pattern reveals that the divine order never saw humans as having inherent worth, only instrumental value. The legacy of these two cities extends throughout the Dark Souls narrative. The precedent set by flooding New Londo, that genocide is an acceptable response to threats against the Age of Fire, foreshadows the cycle of linking the fire that Gwyn would establish. Each linking requires a powerful soul to burn, meaning someone must sacrifice themselves. The same callous calculation that deemed New Londo's population expendable also underpins the entire system of perpetuating the Age of Fire through endless sacrifices. Moreover, the corruption of the Four Kings by Kaathe demonstrates that the Divine Order's grasp on humanity was always tenuous, maintained through a combination of granted power, religious indoctrination, and the threat of overwhelming force. When an alternative was presented, when humans were told they could rule rather than serve, the system proved vulnerable. This suggests that much of the Age of Fire's stability rested on humanity's ignorance of alternatives rather than on any genuine superiority of the Divine Order. The environmental storytelling present in both cities' ruins is masterful, allowing observant players to piece together these histories without extensive exposition. The positioning of corpses in New Londo, the water damage patterns, the locations where people desperately tried to escape, all tell the story of the flooding. In Anor Londo, the contrast between areas maintained by illusion and areas where the illusion has faded reveals the truth of abandonment. The game respects its players enough to let them discover these truths themselves. These stories also raise profound questions about sacrifice and consent. Gwyn's sacrifice in linking the fire is often presented as heroic, the ultimate expression of a leader taking responsibility for his realm. But under this same divine order, an entire city was drowned without giving its citizens any choice in the matter. The juxtaposition asks us to consider: is sacrifice truly noble when you're sacrificing others rather than yourself? And does establishing a system that requires endless repetitions of such sacrifices really solve anything, or does it simply perpetuate suffering? The cycle that Gwyn established by linking the fire creates a loop where these patterns repeat indefinitely. More cities will rise and fall. More populations will be sacrificed. More heroes will be manipulated into burning themselves to fuel a dying flame. The ruins of Anor Londo and New Londo are not unique tragedies, but rather examples of a pattern that will continue as long as the cycle persists. This is perhaps the darkest implication of these histories: that nothing was learned, nothing changed, and the same mistakes will be repeated endlessly. The gods proved incapable of accepting the natural progression from fire to dark, instead choosing to perpetuate their age through increasingly desperate and morally questionable means. And now that system continues even in their absence, maintained by illusions and lies, convincing new generations of heroes to sacrifice themselves for an order that was already failing when the gods still ruled. The choice presented to the player at the end of Dark Souls, to link the fire or let it fade, is fundamentally about whether to perpetuate this cycle. The histories of Anor Londo and New Londo provide evidence for both sides. Link the fire, and perhaps you prevent disasters like the Darkwraith crisis from spreading unchecked. Let it fade, and perhaps you end the cycle of sacrifices and allow something new to emerge, though that new thing is unknown and potentially terrible. What these histories make clear, however, is that maintaining the status quo has its own terrible costs. The Age of Fire was preserved through the drowning of New Londo, through Seath's experiments on innocent maidens, through the corruption and madness of various beings, through the abandonment of Anor Londo and the lies used to conceal that abandonment. These are not incidental costs but fundamental features of a system designed to preserve what cannot be preserved. In the end, the fall of these two great cities teaches us that all things must end, that resisting this truth creates only suffering, and that the price of preservation is often paid by those who never consented to bear it. Whether the player chooses to link the fire or let it fade, the ruins of Anor Londo and New Londo remain as testimony to what has been lost and warning about what may yet be lost if the lessons of history are not heeded. They are the past that haunts the present, the choices that constrain the future, and the questions that demand answers even when those answers lead only to more questions and deeper mysteries in the rich, tragic world of Dark Souls. The Fall of Gods and the Drowning of Men. Extended Analysis and Additional Perspectives Part 2. Deeper themes and unexplored narratives. The role of memory and forgetting in both cities. One of the most profound aspects of Anor Londo and New Londo's tragedies is how memory functions in both locations. In Dark Souls, memory is not merely the recollection of past events, but an active force that shapes the present and constrains the future. The way these cities are remembered, forgotten, or deliberately misremembered tells us much about the nature of power and control in the Age of Fire. Anor Londo's relationship with memory is built entirely on controlled narrative and deliberate forgetting. Gwyndolин's illusions serve not just to make the city appear populated, but to create a false memory of what Anor Londo is. Visitors who arrive and see the radiant Guinevere, the gleaming halls, the eternal sunlight, form memories of divine glory and eternal order. These memories are lies, but they are powerful lies that influence behavior and belief. The chosen undead who accepts Guinevere's quest to link the fire does so based on memories of a city that never truly existed, at least not in the form they witnessed. The deliberate erasure of Gwyn's firstborn son from all records represents another dimension of Anor Londo's manipulation of memory. Whatever transgression this unnamed deity committed was deemed so severe that his very name was stricken from history, his statues defaced, his existence relegated to whispered rumors and fragmented hints. This erasure demonstrates the god's power to shape history, to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. But it also demonstrates the limits of that power, for the erasure is incomplete. Traces remain. Ornstein's eventual departure to seek the Nameless King suggests that some memories cannot be fully suppressed, that truth has a way of persisting despite efforts to eliminate it. New Londo's memory problem is different but equally profound. The city is forgotten not through deliberate erasure but through catastrophic trauma and the passage of time. The citizens who drowned, whose souls remain trapped as ghosts, are caught in an eternal loop of remembering their final moments. They cannot move forward, cannot create new memories, cannot escape the trauma of their deaths. This is memory as prison, as torture, as the opposite of healing or growth. For the outside world, New Londo becomes a cautionary tale that people would prefer to forget. It's easier to avoid thinking about the genocide committed by the gods and their agents, easier to accept the official narrative that the flooding was regrettable but necessary, than to confront the moral horror of what actually happened. The flooded ruins become a place that people avoid not just because it's dangerous, but because it represents truths they don't want to face. Ingward, as the last of the sealers, carries memories that no one else shares or wants to hear. He remembers the decision to flood the city, the execution of that plan, the screams of the drowning, the silence that followed. These memories isolate him, separate him from others who didn't experience what he experienced and don't want to understand it. His position in the ruins, maintaining the seals and guarding against anyone who might undo what was done, is as much about being unable to escape his memories as it is about duty. The contrast between how the two cities handle memory reveals fundamental differences in their nature and their ends. Anor Londo actively constructs false memories through illusion and propaganda, trying to shape how it is perceived and remembered. New Londo is passively forgotten, allowed to sink into obscurity and myth, its true story lost to all but a few who carry the burden of remembering what others choose to forget. This manipulation and loss of memory serves the cycle of linking the fire. If the chosen undead knew the full truth about what Gwyn's order had done, if they understood the complete history of New Londo and Anor Londo, would they be as willing to sacrifice themselves to perpetuate that order? The illusions and the forgetting work together to create a narrative that encourages linking the fire. The gods are glorious and eternal. Their order brought prosperity. The alternatives are chaos and darkness. Your sacrifice is heroic and necessary. But the ruins themselves serve as counter-memory, as physical evidence that contradicts the official narrative. Walking through flooded New Londo or empty Anor Londo creates memories that conflict with what Frampt and the illusions claim. The ghosts, the abandoned halls, the treasures left behind, the mechanical guardians following ancient orders. All of these create an alternative understanding based on observation rather than propaganda. game's item descriptions function as fragments of preserved memory, small pieces of truth that survive the attempts at erasure and forgetting. A weapon's description might mention its wielder and their fate. An armor set might explain the role and purpose of those who wore it. A soul item might provide insight into the character and motivations of the being it came from. These fragments allow observant players to reconstruct histories that the powerful would prefer remain forgotten. The relationship between memory and hollowing adds another layer to this theme. Hollows are beings who have lost their memories, their identities, their sense of purpose. They go hollow because they forget why they continue, what they're fighting for, who they are. The gods' manipulation of memory, their erasure and illusion crafting, is a kind of cultural hollowing, removing true memory and replacing it with false narratives that serve power rather than truth. The economics of souls and the commodification of humanity. Dark Souls' fundamental gameplay mechanic, the collection and expenditure of souls, has profound implications for understanding the economies and power structures of both Anor Londo and New Londo. Souls are simultaneously the essence of living beings, a form of currency, a source of power, and a consumable resource. This multifaceted nature of souls reveals much about how the divine order functions and why it inevitably fails. In Anor Londo's heyday, the gods sat at the top of a soul economy that extracted value from all beings below them. The Lord Souls that Gwyn and his allies claimed from the First Flame were not just powerful. They were the original capital, the fundamental wealth upon which all subsequent power was built. Gwyn's decision to grant fragments of his Lord Soul to useful subordinates, Seath, the Four Kings, was an investment, a way of extending his influence and control by distributing pieces of his power while maintaining ultimate authority. This soul economy created clear hierarchies. The gods, possessing Lord Souls or fragments thereof, stood at the apex. Below them came beings like the Four Knights, who were granted power and privilege based on their service to the gods. Further down came the Silver Knights and other elite servants. And at the bottom were ordinary humans, whose souls were individually weak but collectively valuable due to their numbers. The dark soul that the furtive pygmy found and distributed among humanity created a strange situation within this economy. Humans carried fragments of a Lord Soul, making them potentially powerful, but these fragments were so dispersed that individual humans were weak. However, if humanity could be gathered and concentrated, if enough fragments could be assembled, the potential power was enormous. This is what made the Darkwraith so threatening. They were actively consolidating humanity, concentrating the Dark Soul's power in ways that could challenge the gods' authority. New Londo's economy during its golden age likely functioned as a typical city-state economy, with goods and services exchanged, craftsmen producing valuable items, merchants facilitating trade. But underlying this conventional economy was the soul economy that connected New Londo to Anor Londo. The Four Kings' power came from Gwyn, and they used that power to govern and protect their city. This created a dependency relationship where New Londo's security and prosperity relied on maintaining Gwyn's favor and the flow of power from above. When Kaathe introduced the practice of actively harvesting humanity, he fundamentally disrupted this economy. Instead of souls circulating naturally through death and rebirth, with powerful beings accumulating souls gradually through conquest or service, the Darkwraiths extracted humanity directly from living beings. This was soul extraction as violence, as theft, turning the essence of human beings into a commodity to be stolen and hoarded. The Darkwraiths' activities created a deflationary crisis in human souls. Every person they drained of humanity became hollow, reducing the total amount of viable humanity in circulation. The more successful the Darkwraiths were, the more they depleted the very resource they were harvesting. This unsustainable extraction mirrors economic systems that exploit resources without regard for renewal or long-term viability. The flooding of New Londo can be understood as an extreme form of economic suppression. The gods destroyed an entire city's worth of souls and economic activity to prevent the Darkwraiths from continuing to consolidate humanity. It was acceptable to the gods to eliminate all that value, all those lives and their associated economic activity, rather than allow a competing power structure to emerge based on concentrated dark soul fragments. From Gwyn's perspective, the soul economy needed to be carefully managed to prevent challenges to divine authority. Too much power concentrated in any one place or group posed a threat. The distribution of his Lord's soul fragments was meant to bind powerful beings to him while preventing them from accumulating enough power to challenge him. The failure of this system with the four kings demonstrated that even careful management couldn't prevent ambitious or corrupted beings from seeking to overturn the existing order. The cycle of linking the fire represents the ultimate expression of the soul economy's unsustainability. The first flame must be fed with powerful souls to continue burning. Gwyn fed it his own Lord's soul, the most valuable soul in existence, but this was only a temporary solution. The flame would eventually consume that soul and require another feeding. This creates an economy that inevitably exhausts its capital, consuming the very foundations of its own power in a desperate attempt to maintain that power. The chosen undead exists within this economic system as both participant and victim. They collect souls from enemies to increase their own power, literally consuming the essence of defeated foes to grow stronger. This mirrors the Darkwraith's extraction of humanity but is presented as acceptable, even necessary, because it serves the purpose of creating a being powerful enough to link the fire. The player character becomes a collector and concentrator of souls, preparing themselves to be the next fuel for the flame. The merchants and services found throughout Lordran operate on this soul economy, accepting souls as payment for goods and services. This normalizes the commodification of being itself, making it seem natural that the fundamental essence of existence should be bought and sold. The blacksmith who upgrades weapons for souls, the merchant who sells items for souls, the trainer who teaches skills for souls, all participate in an economy where existence itself is currency. The souls of bosses and major enemies are particularly valuable, described as containing immense power or tremendous strength. These souls can be consumed for large quantities of standard souls, or they can be used to craft unique weapons and items. This choice, consume immediately for power or invest in creating something unique, mirrors economic decisions about consumption versus investment, immediate gratification versus long-term planning. The humanity items themselves, physical manifestations of the dark soul fragments that humans carry, are perhaps the clearest example of commodification. Humanity can be found, traded, consumed to reverse hollowing or kindle bonfires, or offered to covenants. The very essence of what makes humans human is treated as just another resource to be managed and expended for various purposes. This commodification extends to the concept of death itself in Dark Souls. Death is not an end but a transaction, a temporary state from which one returns at the cost of dropped souls and humanity. Even death becomes part of the economy, a risk that affects one's currency and resources but not one's fundamental existence. This changes the nature of risk and sacrifice, making death less final but also less meaningful in some ways. The Dark Moon Blades and other covenants that reward player invasions and PvP activities with souls and items formalize conflict and violence as economic activity. Hunting sinners or invading other players becomes a way to farm resources, to accumulate souls and humanity. This mercenary approach to conflict reflects the broader commodification of existence and action within the soul economy. Understanding both cities through this economic lens reveals that the catastrophes that befell them were not just moral or military failures but economic ones. New Londo's fall began when the Darkwraiths disrupted the soul economy through unsustainable extraction. Anor Londo's decline accelerated when the gods could no longer maintain the economic relationships that sustained their authority, when the cost of maintaining the Age of Fire exceeded the benefits it provided even to those at the top of the hierarchy. The architecture of power, how space reinforces hierarchy. The physical design of both Anor Londo and New Londo is not merely aesthetic or practical. It is deeply political, encoding social hierarchies and power relationships into stone and space. Architecture in Dark Souls functions as a form of propaganda and control, shaping how inhabitants and visitors understand their place in the world and their relationship to authority. Anor Londo's architecture is perhaps the most overtly political in all of Lordran. Every element of its design proclaims divine superiority and human insignificance. The scale is the most immediate and obvious manifestation of this. Doors tower stories high, clearly designed for beings much larger than humans. Halls stretch to impossible lengths, their ceilings so high they seem to touch the clouds. Staircases require dozens of steps to reach the next level, emphasizing the vertical distance between ground and sky, between mortal and divine. This gigantic scale serves multiple purposes. Practically, it accommodates the gods, who are physically larger than humans and possess power that requires grand spaces for its expression. Politically, it makes any human who enters Anor Londo feel small, insignificant, reminded at every turn of the vast gulf between themselves and the divine. Psychologically, it creates an atmosphere of awe and intimidation, making resistance or rebellion feel futile against beings who exist on such a different scale. The vertical organization of Anor Londo reinforces hierarchies through spatial arrangement. The city is built upward, reaching toward the sky, with the most important spaces occupying the highest positions. Gwyn's throne room sits at the pinnacle of the main cathedral, accessible only by ascending multiple levels, crossing dangerous bridges, and passing through numerous guardians. This vertical ascent mirrors social ascent, with each level representing a step closer to divine authority. The use of light in Anor Londo is equally political. The eternal sunlight that bathes the city is not natural but created, a manifestation of Gwyn's power and a constant reminder of his dominion. This light is golden, warm, associated with life and growth, but it is also artificial, maintained by divine will rather than occurring naturally. When Gwyndolin's illusions are dispelled and the light vanishes, replaced by darkness and a pale moon, the truth is revealed. The light was always a construct, a tool of control rather than a natural phenomenon. The materials used in Anor Londo's construction also convey messages about power and permanence. White stone, polished to a gleaming finish, suggests purity and eternal unchanging nature. Gold decorations proclaim wealth and divine favor. Crystal windows, possibly provided by Seath, demonstrate mastery over rare and difficult materials. Every surface is carefully finished, every element precisely placed, creating an impression of perfect order and absolute control. The bridges that connect different sections of Anor Londo are particularly significant. They are narrow, exposed, dangerous to cross, especially when defended by silver knights with massive bows. These bridges serve practical defensive purposes, but they also create psychological barriers. Crossing them requires courage and commitment, a willingness to expose oneself to danger. They function as tests, filters that separate those who are worthy of reaching the inner sanctums from those who are not. New Londo's architecture tells a very different story. While still impressive, it is built on a human scale, with doors and halls sized for human use. The buildings are constructed from darker stone, gray and brown rather than gleaming white, creating an atmosphere that is more grounded, more connected to the earth. The city spreads horizontally rather than reaching vertically, occupying lowland areas rather than elevated positions. This horizontal organization reflects different power dynamics. New Londo was a city of humans ruled by the Four Kings, beings who were elevated above normal humanity but still fundamentally connected to it. The lack of extreme verticality suggests a flatter hierarchy, where the distance between ruler and ruled was significant but not insurmountable. The kings were accessible in ways that the gods of Anor Londo were not. The bridges and waterways that characterize New Londo create a different kind of spatial organization. The city is divided by water, with bridges connecting different districts. This creates natural neighborhoods and divisions, but it also makes the city vulnerable to flooding. The very design that made New Londo prosperous, its relationship with water for trade, transportation, and daily life, became the mechanism of its destruction. The materials and construction techniques used in New Londo suggest a wealthy but not divine city. The stonework is skilled, the buildings well constructed, but they lack the supernatural perfection of Anor Londo's architecture. This creates a sense of humanity's achievement, look what we can build when given the resources and time, but also humanity's limitations. We cannot match the gods, even at our best. The lower levels of New Londo, now permanently flooded, contain the working-class districts and commercial areas. The upper levels, some of which remain above water even after the flooding, house the wealthy and powerful. This vertical stratification within a generally horizontal city reflects the internal hierarchies of New Londo society. When the flood came, it affected the lower levels first and most severely, drowning the poor before the wealthy, a grim commentary on how catastrophes impact different social classes. The Duke's Archives, attached to Anor Londo but occupying its own distinct space, represents yet another architectural expression of power. The archives are a vertical complex, with multiple levels of libraries and research spaces ascending toward Seath's personal chambers at the top. This verticality mirrors Anor Londo's, but in service of knowledge rather than divine authority. The ascent through the archives is an intellectual journey as much as a physical one, passing through increasing levels of esoteric and dangerous knowledge. The prison at the base of the Duke's Archives, where Seath keeps his experimental subjects and captures those who oppose him, inverts the usual top-down hierarchy. The lowest level is where the most terrible things happen, where the victims of Seath's research are kept and tortured. This creates a different kind of spatial horror. Descending into the prison means moving toward increasing suffering and degradation rather than away from power and light. The painted world of Artorias, accessible from Anor Londo, represents architecture as exile and containment. The painted world is not a naturally occurring space but a created pocket dimension designed to hold everything the gods found aberrant or inconvenient. Its architecture mirrors Anor Londo's style in some ways, suggesting it was created by the same divine powers, but it is colder, darker, more overtly hostile. This is architecture as prison, as dumping ground, as the spatial manifestation of rejection and exile. The environmental hazards built into both cities' architecture serve both practical and symbolic purposes. The rafters in Anor Londo's cathedral, which players must navigate carefully to avoid falling to their deaths, represent the precariousness of approaching divine power. One misstep, one failure of courage or skill, and you fall. This creates a spatial metaphor for the risks of challenging or approaching the gods. The flooded ruins of New Londo create different hazards. Limited visibility, the need for curse resistance to fight ghosts, the risk of drowning or getting lost in submerged corridors. All of these reflect the consequences of the gods' decision to flood the city. The architecture has been turned against its original inhabitants, transformed from shelter and civic space into a watery tomb and labyrinth. The use of elevation and depth throughout both cities creates a cosmological structure that maps onto Dark Soul's broader mythology. Height is associated with divinity, light, fire, and authority. Depth is associated with humanity, dark, the abyss, and rebellion. The vertical space between Anor Londo and New Londo mirrors the metaphysical space between the gods and humanity, between the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark. This architectural encoding of hierarchy and power relationships is not merely descriptive. It is prescriptive. The spaces shape behavior, encourage certain movements and discourage others, create pathways that funnel inhabitants and visitors toward particular destinations and away from others. The architecture teaches without words, enforcing social norms and power dynamics through the simple act of moving through space. When the chosen undead navigates these spaces, they are not just traveling from point A to point B. They are moving through a physical manifestation of the Age of Fire's power structures. Ascending Anor Londo's heights, they climb toward divine authority. Descending into New Londo's depths, they move toward humanity's suffering and the dark truths the gods tried to suppress. The spatial journey mirrors and reinforces the narrative journey. The role of covenants. Ideological warfare in ruined cities, both Anor Londo and New Londo serve as home bases for covenants that represent fundamentally opposed ideologies about the nature of the world and the proper course of action regarding the Age of Fire. These covenants are not merely gameplay mechanics. They are factions engaged in an ongoing philosophical and literal war about the future of the world. Understanding these covenants and their relationship to the cities they inhabit reveals deeper layers of the narrative. The Dark Moon Blades, founded by Gwyndolin and operating from Anor Londo, represent the enforcement arm of divine law and the preservation of the gods' order. Members of this covenant hunt sinners, those who have transgressed against the gods or their allies, invading their worlds and punishing them for their crimes. The very structure of the covenant embodies a particular worldview. There are laws ordained by the gods. Violations of these laws are sins, and sins must be punished by righteous force. Gwyndolin's continued recruitment and direction of the Dark Moon Blades, even after the gods have fled Anor Londo, demonstrates a commitment to maintaining order at any cost. The covenant persists not because it serves any practical purpose. The gods are gone, their laws increasingly irrelevant, but because Gwyndolin cannot imagine an alternative. He was raised to serve his father and preserve the divine order, and he continues this service even when that order has clearly failed. The Dark Moon Blades mechanics reveal much about their ideology. They are summoned automatically to punish sinners, invading without consent or warning. This represents justice as divine retribution, swift and inescapable, delivered by agents who believe themselves righteous and their cause just. There is no trial, no opportunity for the accused to defend themselves or explain their actions. The blade appears, delivers punishment, and disappears, a manifestation of divine judgment without mercy or understanding. The rewards for serving as a Dark Moon Blade, souvenirs of reprisal that can be offered to Gwyndolin for rewards and advancement, commodify punishment itself. Sin and its punishment become part of the soul economy, with tangible benefits flowing to those who enforce divine law. This creates incentives for zealous enforcement, for viewing every transgression as an opportunity for advancement within the Covenant's hierarchy. The Darkwraith Covenant, by contrast, represents a complete rejection of the divine order and an embrace of the dark as humanity's true nature and destiny. Darkwraiths serve Kaathe, who preaches that the Age of Fire is ending and should be allowed to end, that humanity should claim its inheritance rather than continuing to serve fading gods. The Covenant's activities, invading other worlds to steal humanity, reflect this ideology in disturbing ways. By draining humanity from other beings, Darkwraiths both gather power for themselves and weaken the forces that support the Age of Fire. Each successful invasion concentrates more of the Dark Soul's power in the hands of those who would see the Age of Dark come to pass. The practice mirrors what Kaathe taught the Four Kings, turning all Darkwraiths into smaller-scale versions of those corrupted rulers. The location of the Darkwraith Covenant in the flooded ruins of New Londo is deeply significant. Kaathe operates from the abyss beneath the city, in the very depths where the Four Kings were imprisoned after their corruption. This suggests several things. First, that the flooding did not destroy Kaathe's influence or end his ability to corrupt others. Second, that he views the tragedy of New Londo as proof of the god's callousness rather than as evidence that his philosophy leads to catastrophe. Third, that he is willing to continue recruiting from among the very ruins his teachings helped create. The contrast between these two covenants reflects the central tension of Dark Soul's narrative. Preserve the dying Age of Fire through continued sacrifice, or allow it to end and embrace the Age of Dark despite not knowing what that age will bring. The Dark Moon Blades fight to preserve order, law, and the god's authority. The Darkwraiths fight to overturn that order and claim power for humanity. Both believe they are fighting for the right cause, and both inflict suffering on others in pursuit of their goals. There are other covenants associated with these cities in various ways. The Princess's Guard, though largely inactive by the time of the game, was devoted to protecting Guinevere and serving her interests. The fact that this covenant exists but has no active leader, Guinevere having fled and only an illusion remaining, symbolizes the abandonment theme that pervades Anor Londo. The covenant structure remains, but its purpose has been hollowed out. The mechanics of covenant loyalty and betrayal in Dark Souls add another layer to understanding these factions. Joining a covenant requires commitment, often symbolized by offering something valuable. Betraying a covenant by joining another has consequences, requiring atonement before one can rejoin. This creates a system where ideological commitment has real costs and changing one's mind or switching sides requires acknowledging wrongdoing and making amends. The PvP aspects of these covenants. Dark Moon Blades hunting sinners, Darkwraiths invading to steal humanity. Turn ideological conflict into gameplay conflict. When a Dark Moon Blade invades to punish a sinner, it's not just a PvP match. It's an enactment of ideological warfare, divine law enforcement clashing with individual transgression. When a Darkwraith invades to steal humanity, they are performing in miniature the larger Project Kaathe envisions, concentrating the Dark Soul's power to hasten the Age of Dark. The rewards and progression systems of these covenants also reflect their ideologies. Dark Moon Blades earn rewards for successful punishments, creating a system where righteousness and advancement are linked, where serving divine law brings tangible benefits. Darkwraiths accumulate humanity, gathering the very essence of the Dark Soul that Kaathe claims is humanity's true inheritance. Both systems incentivize continued participation and create feedback loops that reinforce covenant loyalty. The narrative implications of player choice regarding these covenants are profound. A player who joins the Dark Moon Blades is choosing to uphold the divine order, to serve Gwyndolin and through him Gwyn's legacy, to punish those who transgress against the gods. A player who joins the Darkwraiths is choosing to reject that order, to serve Kaathe's vision of humanity's future, to actively work toward hastening the Age of Dark. The game allows both choices without explicitly labeling either as right or wrong, leaving moral judgment to the player. The existence of these active covenants operating from ruined cities creates a strange temporal layering. The cities themselves are ruins, monuments to past glory and catastrophe, but the covenants continue functioning, recruiting new members, pursuing their objectives, fighting their ideological wars. This suggests that the conflicts that destroyed these cities are not resolved but merely ongoing, continuing in new forms with new participants but fundamentally unchanged in their essential nature. The fact that both covenants involve invading other players' worlds is significant. Neither covenant is content to simply defend a position or maintain a status quo. Both are actively aggressive, projecting force into other spaces, imposing their ideology through violence. This mirrors the broader pattern in Dark Souls where major factions and figures attempt to impose their will on others rather than allowing freedom of choice. The symbolism of water and light, the flooding of New Londo and the false light of Anor Londo, represent two different but related forms of deception and control, both using natural elements, water and light, as tools of power and manipulation. Understanding the symbolic weight these elements carry helps illuminate the deeper meanings encoded in both cities' designs and fates. Water in Dark Souls is generally associated with cleansing, barriers, and the unconscious. It appears throughout the game in various forms, each carrying slightly different symbolic weight. The flooded ruins of New Londo represent water as execution and imprisonment, as the tool of genocide and the substance that traps ghosts and Darkwraiths alike. This is water corrupted from its cleansing and life-giving properties into an instrument of death and containment. The darkness of New Londo's floodwater is particularly significant. Normal water should be clear or at least allow some light penetration, but New Londo's water is perpetually murky, visibility limited to almost nothing. This suggests that the magical seals that contain it have altered its nature, making it something other than normal water. It has become a substance of entrapment and concealment, hiding the truth of what lies beneath while simultaneously preventing anything from escaping. The fact that ghosts can exist underwater but living beings cannot creates an inverted environment where the dead are at home and the living are intruders and victims. This inversion reflects the broader catastrophe. New Londo was supposed to be a place where living humans thrived, but it became a place where only the dead remain. The water enforces this transition, maintaining the separation between the world of the living and the realm of the dead that New Londo has become. Water as a barrier appears throughout Dark Souls in various forms, but New Londo's flood represents the most extreme version of this symbolism. The water doesn't just mark a boundary, it fills the entire space, transforming the city into an underwater labyrinth. To enter deeply into New Londo requires either cursing oneself or acquiring items that allow one to combat ghosts, essentially requiring one to become partially dead oneself to navigate a dead city. The act of draining New Londo, breaking the seals and allowing the water to flow out, is symbolically significant beyond its practical effects. It represents a refusal to let the past remain buried and forgotten, a determination to confront what was done rather than allowing it to remain hidden beneath the water. It also represents a willingness to release what was contained, to accept the risks that come with revealing truth and undoing the terrible but effective containment the flood provided. Light in Anor Londo functions very differently but serves similar purposes of control and deception. The eternal golden sunlight that bathes the city is presented as natural and divine, a blessing that proves the god's power and benevolence. But it is actually artificial, created and maintained by Gwyndolin's illusions to preserve the appearance of divine presence and eternal glory. This is light as propaganda, as a tool to shape perception and control narrative. The warmth and beauty of Anor Londo's light create feelings of awe and comfort, encouraging visitors to see the city and its divine inhabitants as glorious and good. The psychological impact of the light is subtle but powerful, influencing emotion and perception in ways that verbal arguments or obvious propaganda could not. Standing in that golden radiance, it becomes easier to believe that the gods are worthy of worship and service, that linking the fire to preserve this beauty is the right choice. When the illusions are dispelled and the false light vanishes, the transformation is shocking. The same city that appeared glorious in golden sunlight looks cold and abandoned under the pale moonlight that replaces it. Nothing about the physical architecture has changed, but the different light reveals different truths. The moon's light is real rather than artificial, but it illuminates emptiness and decay rather than glory and divine presence. This contrast between false golden light and true pale moonlight reflects Gwyndolin's own nature and tragedy. He was born with an affinity for the moon rather than the sun, which his father Gwyn found problematic enough to raise him as a daughter rather than a son. Gwyndolin's power is lunar, connected to night and truth-revealing rather than the sun's life-giving warmth. Yet he uses this power to create illusions of his father's solar glory, denying his own nature to serve Gwyn's legacy. The symbolism of the sun in Dark Souls is complex and often ironic. The sun is associated with Gwyn and the Age of Fire, representing life, warmth, and divine authority. But the sun above Anor Londo is artificial, and the true sun visible elsewhere in Lordran often appears weak or distant, suggesting the fading of the age it represents. The contrast between the promised eternal sun and the actual declining sun reflects the gap between propaganda and reality. Light and dark in Dark Souls are not simple good versus evil binaries. Light represents the Age of Fire, the gods' order, authority, and civilization. But it also represents deception, as shown by Anor Londo's false light, and the dangerous extremes of chaos, as shown by the Witch of Izalith's chaos flame. Dark represents the Age of Dark, humanity's nature, and the unknown future. But it also represents corruption, as shown by the Darkwraiths and the Abyss, and the loss of identity and purpose, as shown by Hollowing. The interplay of water and light in both cities creates rich symbolic landscapes. New Londo is dark and underwater, doubly hidden and obscured. Anor Londo is bright and elevated, doubly visible but doubly deceptive. The true horror of New Londo is revealed when one drains the water and can finally see what was done. The true horror of Anor Londo is revealed when one dispels the light and can finally see what remains. Both elements, water and light, are natural forces that have been weaponized or manipulated by powers seeking to control perception and reality. The Sealers used water to drown a city. Gwyndolin uses light to hide abandonment and decay. In both cases, the manipulation serves to preserve the divine order at the cost of truth and at the expense of those who have no power to resist. The permanent nature of both manipulations is telling. New Londo remains flooded even ages after the catastrophe, the seals still holding. Anor Londo's illusions persist even after all but Gwyndolin have fled. Both cities are frozen in moments of catastrophe or deception, unable to move forward, trapped by the very mechanisms that were supposed to preserve or protect them. Water and light also represent different approaches to the same problem: how to deal with threats to the divine order. Water was used to contain and conceal, to drown the Darkwraith threat along with everyone else in New Londo. Light was used to distract and deceive, to hide the god's abandonment behind beautiful illusions. Both approaches avoid directly addressing the underlying problems, instead using natural forces as tools to create false realities that serve power rather than truth. If you're new here, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue exploring the deeper meanings hidden within the games we love.